Chapter-2 Dead in the Water. September 9th, 2011. 5 a.m. Rays of umber, ochre, and gold that only people who wake up ungodly early see slipped through the technicolor trees and shone on the winding scimitar of glassy water. Pull! Goddammit, pull! Every cell in Tyler's body surged as he put his weight against the oar. He groaned as his broad shoulders opened like the wings of a bird, his frame stretching into the stroke with near-perfect precision. Directly in front of him, Cameron moved in parallel, two parts of a coordinated, well-oiled machine. From afar, they were a duet of smooth, controlled motion, but up close, inside the carved-out fiberglass shell slicing across the crystal water, it was all sinew and sweat and grime, knots of muscles rising and falling beneath the skin, bruised and blistered and torn. The oars bit into the water, propelling the boat forward in sudden surges. The brothers weren't just synchronized in form in the mechanical motion of their muscles against the carbon fiber oars. They were physically identical. Born to work as two halves of a whole, an advantage that had helped push them from a curiosity, identical twins who rowed crew together, to a world-class team of two that could compete at the Olympic level. Except today, the machine wasn't perfect. Something in the invisible gears that connected them was perceptibly off. Without even glancing, Tyler could sense the 5 other boats alongside them, gliding neck and neck like gulls in a formation toward the finish line just a few meters ahead. From the shore, it would be almost imperceptible, but from his position, he could tell they were half a foot behind the closest of the other pairs, 6, maybe 7 inches behind the pair who had won gold in Athens in the men's 8. That pair was trading back and forth with a pair of University of Washington alums who had won nationals 3 years in a row. The armada roared toward the finish line. Tyler's eyes narrowed as he pulled with every ounce of strength he had left, but he knew, deep down, it would not be enough. Seconds later, an air horn sounded as each boat's bow ball breached the finish line. The race was over. The twins had finished dead last. The inches that separated the 6 boats may as well have been miles. A crew race was a battle that was almost always decided long before those last few meters. Rowing wasn't so much something you won, but something you managed not to lose. It was a war of breaking points. Whoever could swallow the most pain usually crossed the finish line first. And going into the well again and again was the only way to raise your tolerance for pain. The twins slumped over their oars, utterly exhausted. Lactic acid, a byproduct of intense exertion, coursed through their muscles. Every cell in their bodies was on fire. Their lungs were burning. The puddles left by their oars, the exhaust of the energy they had poured into mowing their boat down the racecourse, dissipated quickly into the surface of Lake Carnegie in Princeton, New Jersey. They knew they should start cooling down and make their way back to the boathouse, but at the moment, they didn't even have the energy to lift their oars, let alone their bodies, and start paddling back home. "It's just one practice," Tyler said. "Next time we'll get it back." Cameron didn't lift his head. "If we bumped the stroke rate up a few beats, we'd be on the right side of that finish." He could tell from Cameron's tone that the morning's loss was weighing much heavier on him, and maybe both of them, than it should have. Certainly they had fared poorly in races before. The ability to compartmentalize the bad practices, leaving them on the water, was an important skill in the sport of rowing, a skill that had allowed the twins to litigate against one of the biggest companies in the world while simultaneously training for the Olympics. At the level they were rowing, the slightest hiccup in rhythm or technique could translate to defeat. And against the sort of competitors who were training for the Olympic team, every stroke mattered. The pristine setting of Lake Carnegie, 4 miles of sheet-flat water in Princeton, New Jersey, that had served as the national training center for the Olympic rowing team for decades, was the rowers' version of an even playing field, which meant every practice came down to a combination of muscle, technique, training, and willpower. Victory was a matter of the horse, not the chariot. Lake Carnegie was literally made for rowing. Before 1902, the Princeton team had rowed on the nearby Delaware Canal, a busy waterway jammed with cargo boats and pleasure cruisers, but the rowers had grown tired of dodging freighters and Sunday sailors. In a fortuitous stroke of timing, a former coxswain and alumnus was commissioned to paint a portrait of the steel baron Andrew Carnegie, and use the time he was supposed to be concerned with brushes and oil paints to pitch the idea of creating a lake for the use of the Ivy League's college crew team. Tickled by the idea, the financier had donated over $100,000, a fortune at the time, for the construction project. With the help of a handful of rowing alumni, Carnegie had secretly bought up all the land in the area, then dammed off the Millstone River, moving earth and water to create the perfect rowing playground. It wasn't long before the Olympic national team had recognized the value of the private, protected strip of water next to one of the most storied educational centers in the world. Soon, the best rowers from all over the country were being invited to train on the lake that stretched past the century-old boathouse. Tyler and Cameron had spent countless mornings gliding beneath the stone arch bridges that straddled the lake at its narrower points, reminiscent of the stone abutments that punctured the snake-like Charles River in Cambridge, Massachusetts. There they had cut their rowing teeth under the legendary Harry Parker. By the year 2000, when the twins matriculated to Harvard, Parker had been coaching the Harvard men's team for nearly 40 years. Harvard oarsmen, coached by Harry Parker, had competed at every Olympic Games since 1964. The twins would continue this tradition by representing the United States in the men's coxless pair at the 2008 Olympic Games in Beijing, China. At Harvard, the twins had been undefeated national champions. Cameron, the southpaw twin, had rowed port and sat in sixth seat of the heavyweight varsity crew, while Tyler, the righty twin, had rowed starboard and sat behind him in five seat. In an 8-man boat, the twins' seats were located in the engine room, the term for the middle of the boat, where the biggest and most powerful rowers sat. The college newspaper sports writers referred to Cameron and Tyler as the Twin Towers, and nicknamed their crew the God Squad, because some of them were devout Christians who believed in God, while the rest believed they were gods. The God Squad was the most famous Harvard crew since the storied Rude and Smooth crew of the mid-1970s, which was chronicled in David Halberstrom's book, The Amateurs. This crew earned its nickname because of its smooth rowing and rude antics. Much of these larger-than-life oarsmen went on to compete in the Olympics and become wildly successful after their rowing careers. Dick Cashin, the crew's sixth seat, became a private equity tycoon in New York City and donated the funds to build the Harry Parker Boathouse, a community boathouse open to the public and located on the Charles River upstream from Newell and Weld, the Harvard men's and women's boathouses. The twins' high school rowing coach had given them a copy of The Amateurs during their first season when they were freshmen in high school back in 1997. It was no coincidence that they ended up applying to Harvard a few years later. When they arrived at Harvard as freshmen in 2000, they hoped to one day fill the shoes of this fabled crew. And fill them they did. The God Squad never lost a collegiate race. In fact, they never really had a close race. They were so fast that they went to the 2004 World Cup in Lucerne, Switzerland, and placed sixth, beating the Olympic team 8-man boats from Britain and France. After Lucerne, they competed at the Henley Royal Regatta, the pinnacle of the British rowing season, an event on par with tennis at Wimbledon and horse racing at Ascot. At Henley, the God Squad defeated Cambridge University on their way to the Grand Challenge Cup finals, then raced gallantly against the Dutch Olympic team, losing by 2/3 of a boat length. A month later, the same Dutch 8-man boat went on to win Olympic silver in the 2004 Olympic Games in Athens, Greece. This put into perspective just how fast the God Squad really was, and forever immortalized them in the pantheon of collegiate rowing history. After the twins graduated from Harvard in 2004, they made their way from the shores of the Charles River to the banks of Lake Carnegie, which was home to the United States national rowing team. Perhaps even more so than the Charles River, Carnegie was a magnificent setting. Unfortunately, This didn't make the loss that morning any easier to swallow. To Tyler, it wasn't just a meaningless race in another practice. The moment felt existential. The London Olympics were 10 months away. They could train day and night, push their bodies to an extreme they'd reached before, maybe even get on form enough to medal. It would be an incredible honor, a true victory, and it wouldn't change anything. Not who they were, not how they were viewed by the world. They were a book cover that had already been judged, and judged again. First by a court system they believed had been stacked against them from the very beginning, and then by public opinion, a popular conception and social conscience fueled by a movie that had told only enough of the story to paint them as caricatures, weighed down by how they looked and what they were supposed to represent. Only they knew the true story, and what really had gone down after Cameron's one-on-one meeting in that glass cage. How, in the blink of an eye, they somehow lost by winning. $65 million! Calamari, their lawyer, was nearly shouting at them. He held the one-page, handwritten settlement offer in one hand and a slice of pizza in the other. "This is incredible! Don't you see that this is incredible?" Teardrops of melted cheese were falling from the end of the pizza as he waved it toward the twins. The casual-dressed lawyer was clearly excited about the settlement offer. Tyler stared at the settlement offer dangling from Calamari's hand. $65 million sounded great until you juxtaposed it with Zuckerberg's $15 billion and growing slice of the pie. "There's something missing here," Tyler started, when Calamari cut him off, that damn slice of pizza swinging so hard it threatened to break free from the man's fingers and rocket toward the twins. "Are you kidding? Guys, it's Christmas in February. He's agreed to settle, and it's a fortune." Tyler looked at Cameron, who looked just as exasperated as he felt. Sure, Zuckerberg had offered to settle. As stubborn as he was probably always going to settle. He might wait until the eve of trial and settle on the courthouse steps, but he was going to settle. Even if deep down the Facebook CEO didn't think the Winklevoss twins' claims had merit, they had always assumed that he knew they had enough. The atmospherics alone were too much. And there were the emails. There were a lot of emails, and the twins thought they were damaging enough to tie him up in knots and turn him into a human pretzel on the stand. A public trial had to be too risky to consider. Fraud was not something to leave to 12 jurors to decide. Worse yet, Zuckerberg knew that the other side was pushing for forensic discovery, electronic imaging, of his computer's hard drive, the same computer he'd used while back at Harvard. As the twins would find out later, Zuckerberg had good reason not to want to let that happen. Facebook was a monster, a true Silicon Valley unicorn that was gaining millions of users by the day. Zuckerberg had become internationally famous, the young CEO of a company that was rapidly becoming one of the biggest success stories in the world. Soon, no doubt, Facebook would seek an IPO, and the last thing Zuckerberg or Facebook's board of directors needed before offering its stock up to the public was the unearthing of potentially damning documents. Zuckerberg had to know where such a process would lead. The hard drive from his college computer contained a trove of instant messages, IMs, that Zuckerberg had written while he was a student at Harvard. Some of them were to Adam D'Angelo, a friend and talented computer programmer who had attended Caltech and was now Facebook's CTO. These messages had been discovered during a court-ordered forensic analysis of Zuckerberg's hard drive, but Zuckerberg's attorney, Neil Chatterjee, had so far refused to provide them to the other side. It was a classic example of Schrodinger's cat. These IMs didn't exist if he settled. They existed if he continued to dig in his heels. And even if they were produced to the other side under a protective order, there was no way of guaranteeing they wouldn't find their way onto the internet, a medium written in pen, not pencil. Eventually, of course, Zuckerberg and his team's fears would be realized, but luckily for him, not until years after he settled with the twins. A particularly intrepid journalist at Business Insider, Nicholas Carlson, got a hold of a number of those IMs which were later confirmed by Zuckerberg himself when they were republished by The New Yorker. In one message, Zuckerberg spoke with D'Angelo about the Harvard Connection/Connect You website he was working on for Tyler, Cameron, and Divya. As reported by Carlson in the Business Insider, Zuckerberg remarked to D'Angelo, "So you know how I'm making that dating site? I wonder how similar that is to the Facebook thing, because they're probably going to be released around the same time. Unless I fuck the dating site people over and quit on them right before I told them I'd have it done." From there, Zuckerberg's thoughts only got more damning. "I also hate the fact that I'm doing it for other people, haha. Like I hate working under other people. I feel like the right thing to do is finish the Facebook and wait until the last day before I'm supposed to have their thing ready and then be like, look, yours isn't as good as this, so if you want to join mine, you can, otherwise I can help you with yours later. Or do you think that's too dick?" D'Angelo later asked Zuckerberg what path he was going to pursue in terms of dealing with the twins. Zuckerberg responded, "Yeah, I'm going to fuck them, probably in the ear. In legal terms, the IMs may have been in a gray area. They were not a smoking gun, but they were still dangerous. With respect to Zuckerberg's moral character at that point in his life, they were less gray than black and white. When, in another IM, he told his friend, "You can be unethical and still be legal, and that's the way I live my life." He was voicing a philosophy that would make future Facebook stockholders rightly nervous. No doubt in the years since college, Zuckerberg had changed. How could someone go through what he went through and not change in all sorts of ways, most of which would remain unknown to most of the world? Perhaps, as he'd later tell The New Yorker, he truly regretted the sentiments in those IMs. But the IMs were only part of the story. There were also actions that went along with those words. Before the Winklevoss twins had approached Zuckerberg, his bold venture at the time was facemash.com, a Harvard version of the website Hot or Not. This site scraped photos of Harvard female students from the online Harvard directory and, without their consent, displayed these photos, 2 at a time and side by side, on facemash.com, so visitors to the website could rate who was the hotter. In one IM exchange, he even considered whether or not he should allow these photos of Harvard females on facemash.com to be compared side by side to photos of farm animals. This resulted in charges that he breached the Harvard Computer Network security, violated copyrights, and violated individual students' privacy, and almost got Zuckerberg expelled by the Harvard Administrative Board. After being left in the lurch by Zuckerberg and surprised by the launch of Facebook on February 4, 2004, the twins and their friend Divya scrambled to find programmers to finish Connect You, which finally went live on May 21, 2004. Not content with merely sandbagging his classmates and the enormous first-mover advantage it afforded him, Zuckerberg appeared to be determined to add insult to injury. As reported in the Business Insider, Zuckerberg recounted to D'Angelo via IM, "We've exploited a flaw in the Connect You system and created another Cameron Winklevoss account. We copied his account like his profile and everything, except I made his answers all like white supremacist." The fake account Zuckerberg created to impersonate Cameron was not just an assault on Cameron's character. It is also a revealing insight into how Zuckerberg had seen and judged the pair from the moment he'd met them in the Kirkland dining hall. Cameron Winklevoss. Hometown. I'm fucking privileged. Where do you think I'm from? High school. You're not even allowed to speak its name. Ethnicity. Better than you. Height. 7'4". Body type. Athletic. Hair color. Aryan blonde. Eye color. Sky blue. Favorite quote. Homeless people are worth their weight in paper clips. I hate black people. Languages. Waspy. Clubs. My dad got me into the porcelain. Interests. Squandering my father's money. If he had indeed hacked into the website he was supposed to have helped build, in the twins' opinion, Zuckerberg had potentially violated federal law. And the fake profile was just the start. In later IMs, Zuckerberg bragged about further hacking Connect You's code and deactivating user accounts, just for fun. and there was more. In the spring of 2004, Cameron sent an email to the tips email inbox of the Harvard Crimson to notify them about Zuckerberg's duplicitous behavior. A reporter named Tim McGinn was assigned to the story and began to investigate. Tim met with Cameron, Tyler, and Divya to hear their story and to review emails sent between Cameron and Mark. He then reached out to Zuckerberg for his side of the story. As Cameron was later informed, Zuckerberg went into the Harvard Crimson offices and tried to convince McGinn and his editor, Elizabeth Theodore, not to run with the story. When McGinn and Theodore decided to continue the investigation, Zuckerberg apparently hacked into McGinn's Harvard email account to try and keep track of the investigation and whether or not a story would be written. As Cameron learned, Zuckerberg was able to hack into McGinn's email by exploiting the data in the Facebook database and violating the trust and privacy of his own users. More specifically, apparently, he looked in the Facebook database for McGinn's Facebook account password in hopes that McGinn used the same password for his Facebook account as he did for his Harvard email account. He also reviewed Facebook logs for all of McGinn's failed login attempts, thinking that McGinn had at some point mistakenly entered his Harvard email account password into Facebook when trying to log in. Armed with McGinn's private information dug out of the bowels of Facebook, Zuckerberg was able to break into McGinn's email and read all of his emails, including the ones he'd had with Cameron, Tyler, and Divya. Mark also saw email communication between McGinn and Theodore, in which Theodore recounted their meeting with Zuckerberg at the Harvard Crimson offices. Zuckerberg did seem very sleazy, and I thought that some of his answers to the questions were not very direct or open. I also thought that his reaction to the website was very, very weird. While Zuckerberg's hack of ConnectU was arguably outside the university's jurisdiction, Zuckerberg's hacking of another student's Harvard email account was not. In fact, it breached the Harvard Computer Network security and violated an individual student's privacy, not to mention Facebook's own privacy policy today. And Zuckerberg was already in trouble for similar violations as a result of the FaceMash.com debacle earlier that school year. At the time, Harvard was unaware of Zuckerberg's additional violations. A few years later, however, Zuckerberg's second offense became public. Despite the fact that Zuckerberg was, and still is, a Harvard student to this day, he left indefinitely on a voluntary leave of absence to run Facebook after his sophomore year. Harvard has never taken any public action related to this hacking. In total, the existence of that hard drive from Zuckerberg's college computer must have meant he'd never risk a trial, and not just because his IMs regarding the twins would blemish his sterling reputation as a boy wonder CEO, but more importantly, because they would call into question the very basis of the revolution he was creating. If you ever need info about anyone at Harvard, just ask. I have over 4,000 emails, pictures, addresses, SNS. People just submitted it. I don't know why. They trust me. Dumb fucks. Private IMs between any other college kids could perhaps be explained away as the digital equivalent of locker room talk. But in the context of a college dropout whose mission was to connect the world, and by doing so would hold the privacy of millions of people in the palm of his hand, they had the potential to permanently derail him. And certainly, to the twins, the IMs proved what they had been saying all along. Zuckerberg had knowingly wronged them. The image of a likable nerd who wore a hoodie and talked about building things that are cool was not the Mark Zuckerberg they knew. Those stark words and actions revived an anger in them that made it difficult to let things go, even when it seemed to their legal team that they had won. "This is bullshit," Tyler said, still looking at the paper covered in chicken scratch. "We deserve to be rightful owners." Calamari was still grinning over his celebratory pizza. He had just finished a call with John Quinn, the Quinn in Quinn Emanuel, presumably to brag about the potential settlement result. They didn't get it. These lawyers didn't get a lot of things. Calamari could barely operate the PowerPoint presentation that their lead lawyer had prepared for the opening mediation argument. The irony of a lawyer who could barely operate a computer being a principal in the fight over one of the largest technology companies in the world, was almost too much. Calamari mispronounced Zuckerberg's name a handful of times, calling him Zuckerberger, and now he was doing an end zone dance with John Quinn before the ink on the offer sheet had even been applied, much less dried. To Tyler, this wasn't about money. This had never been about the money. As Zuckerberg had so delicately pointed out in the fake profile he'd made of Cameron, Tyler and Cameron had been born into money. But what Zuckerberg didn't know was that their father had built that privileged childhood for them through sweat, brains, and character. He'd propelled himself upward from a heritage of hard-working German immigrants, a family of coal miners, and he'd made it his mission to instill in the brothers a sense of right and wrong so strict that it could often be blinding. Winning didn't matter if it didn't happen the right way, for the right reasons. Tyler simply couldn't just walk away, not even for $65 million in cash. "We'll take it in stock," he said suddenly. Cameron nodded. Calamari's face blanched. His greasy slice of pizza made a wet thud on the table. "Are you crazy? You want to invest in that putz?" Calamari exclaimed, looking incredulous, then glaring at his associates to nod their heads in disapproval. Immediately, he and his team embarked on a campaign to convince Tyler and Cameron that they were being foolish, batshit crazy, that they should take the cash and run. It appeared that lawyers didn't like getting paid in stock, the price of which could go up or down. For them, cash was king. All of a sudden, Quinn Emanuel's 20% contingency fee, a cool $13 million for 6 months of work, looked a lot more uncertain. All 5 Quinn Emanuel lawyers in the room pleaded with the twins, but they would not be swayed. In the twins' mind, taking stock was a way of going back in time and righting a wrong. As founders who hadn't been cut out by Zuckerberg, they would have had stock. Here, after all these years, was their chance to get back, at least in part, to where they should have started. 100 lawyers in Hawaiian shirts and sandals wouldn't be able to convince them otherwise. Ultimately, the twins and their lawyers reached a compromise. The twins would take $20 million in cash, and the rest of the $65 million settlement, approximately $45 million, in stock. For the foolish, batshit crazy twins, this proved to be one of the greatest investments of all time. Their lawyers saw none of that upside. After Facebook's IPO, the twins' $45 million in shares soared. It appreciated 15 times and went on to be worth more than $500 million. If Quinn Emanuel had taken its fee in stock, the firm would have earned upward of $300 million for 6 months of work. Sitting in that boat, drifting in near silence down the center of that man-made lake in New Jersey, watching the other boats head for the boathouse, Tyler was palpably aware of the toll that fight had taken on them. The more public their battle had become, culminating in the movie that had made them household names, the more they had come under assault, both legally and in the public eye. Shortly after they'd settled, the twins learned that Facebook had received a valuation that had been conducted by an independent third-party valuation firm. This valuation, which Facebook used to comply with IRS rules and the U.S. tax code, valued the twins' Facebook shares at a quarter of the price that Zuckerberg's settlement offer had told them they were worth. Was it another ear-fucking? It certainly sounded like securities fraud to the twins. The withholding of material, independent valuation during a settlement agreement that involved a securities transaction. But Facebook maintained that they had not withheld anything or deceived anyone. Armed with both the valuation and the leaked IMs that had come out via Business Insider, the twins had tried to get the case reopened, an effort that was shot down by a California federal judge, and the verdict was later upheld by California's Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. Both courts rejected the twins' arguments. The result hadn't been surprising to the twins. They were fighting Facebook, now a $100 billion monster, in its own backyard. The stakes had become enormous, and the twins and Zuckerberg weren't the only ones at the table. President Obama had visited Facebook's headquarters after being elected in 2008, a win credited in part to Zuckerberg's site, which his campaign had used to connect with millions of voters dubbed the Facebook generation, and earned him the title of the Facebook president. And it didn't hurt that one of Obama's campaign gurus was Chris Hughes, one of Zuckerberg's roommates, who had run marketing and communications for Facebook prior to joining the Obama campaign. This all culminated with Zuckerberg adorning the cover of Time magazine in 2010 as Time Person of the Year for connecting more than 500 million people and mapping the social relations among them, for creating a new system of exchanging information, and for changing how we live our lives. Battling a tech colossus in California did not exactly get you favorable odds. The twins felt that the decks were stacked against them, and it was all aces for Zuckerberg. They believed Zuckerberg had wronged them in 2004 by stealing their idea for what became Facebook, had wronged them a second time by deep-sixing the damaging IMs during litigation, and had wronged them a third time on the settlement agreement's stock valuation. They had indeed lost by winning. Despite receiving stock potentially worth hundreds of millions of dollars, an enormous sum by any standard, the twins felt like losers. Zuckerberg had managed to fuck them in the ear over and over again. And not only that, going up against Zuckerberg in such a public fashion had taken its toll on their image in the court of public opinion. They were torn apart in the media and ridiculed by the blogosphere as spoiled and entitled brats with a nasty case of sour grapes. Whereas each time another example of Zuckerberg's Shakespearean betrayals became public, the media seemed to look the other way. Even Larry Summers, the former president of Harvard, took a shot at them, publicly calling them assholes while on stage at Fortune's Brainstorm Tech Conference hosted at the Aspen Institute. The twins' offense? Wearing jackets and ties when they'd attended President Summers' office hours in April of 2004 to discuss Zuckerberg's duplicitous behavior they believed was a direct violation of the Harvard Student Handbook, specifically the part of the handbook that stated, "All students will be honest and forthcoming in their dealings with members of the Harvard community." Summers' public attack seemed so unfair, so disgraceful for an educator, let alone a current Harvard professor, that the twins wrote an open letter to then Harvard president Drew Faust expressing their concern regarding Summers' conduct. At March office hours, we, Cameron, Tyler, and Divya, waited in his, President Summers's, reception area, but were told that we would have to return next month because there were more students in the queue than time allowed. In April of 2004, we returned to office hours and were successful in meeting with President Summers. His manner was not inconsistent with his reputation and present-day admissions of being tactfully challenged. It was not his failure to shake hands with the three of us upon entering his office. Doing so would have required him to take his feet off his desk and stand up from his chair, nor his tenor that was most alarming, but rather his scorn for a genuine discourse on deeper ethical questions, Harvard's honor code, and its applicability or lack thereof. We now further understand why our meeting was less than productive. Someone who does not value ethics with respect to his own conduct would likely have little interest in this subject as it related to the conduct of others. Perhaps there is a variability of aptitude for decency and professionalism among university faculty. Regardless, it is deeply disturbing that a professor of this university openly admits to making character judgments of students based on their appearance. It goes without saying that every student should feel free to bring issues forward, dress how they see fit, or express themselves without fear of prejudice or public disparagement from a fellow member of the community, much less so from a faculty member. Ironically, our choice of attire that day was made out of respect and deference to the office of the president. As the current president, we respectfully ask for you to address this unprecedented betrayal of the unique relationship between teacher and student. We look forward to your response. Despite Summers openly admitting to making character judgments about the twins, his students, based on their appearance, the media snickered, and President Faust sidestepped their letter and declined to admonish him. Perhaps it was no surprise that Summers' tenure as president of Harvard was quick and judged by many to be a failure. In January 2005, at an academic conference on diversity in the sciences and engineering, Summers caused an uproar when he called into question the innate aptitude of women, as compared to men, in the sciences. 3 months later, the Harvard faculty passed a no-confidence vote in his leadership, and less than a year later, on February 21, 2006, Summers resigned. No one since the Civil War had served a shorter term as president of Harvard. After Harvard, Summers landed a job in the Obama administration, though Obama would soon pass on him for chair of the Federal Reserve, instead choosing Janet Yellen, a woman. Ironically, despite not appreciating Facebook's enormous potential in its earliest days when it was sitting right in front of him in Harvard Yard, dismissing it during his meeting with the twins as an inconsequential student project, Summers managed to find his way onto a few boards of tech companies in Silicon Valley, including Square. This was thanks to help from Sheryl Sandberg, who had joined Facebook as its chief operating officer in 2008. She was a former student of Summers and later worked for him when he was Secretary of the Treasury under President Clinton. Perhaps Summers' friendship with Sandberg had inspired him to lean in against the twins and try to even the score. Who knew? "No matter how many times we win this race," Cameron said from the stern of the boat, "it isn't going to matter." He was right. They had ended up with a vast amount of money, but to the world, they were losers. They weren't going to change anyone's minds by competing in another Olympics. Even standing on a podium wasn't going to get them any sense of justice. They would just be dumb jocks who rode off into the sunset. "It's not personal," one of their lawyers had told them. "It's business." This was when they'd started questioning the number of Facebook shares Zuckerberg had given them. To Tyler, that was just as bad as Zuckerberg's "I am." You can be unethical and still be legal. It had never been just business between them and Zuckerberg. It had always been personal. And they had lost. If they wanted to change that narrative, they couldn't do it with an oar. They needed to go back to the arena where it had all started and begin to fight all over again.